Be to God. And thank you, Joanne. And I should have warned you that passage is full of names. But what I wanted to do this morning is to get into the Old Testament, and we're going to do a short series on the life of this wonderful man, King Hezekiah, king of Judah. The southern kingdom, Israel, was divided at the time. There's the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, which included Jerusalem. Where Hezekiah reigned as king. And Hezekiah, the thing about him is he's noted for being good. We often call him Good King Hezekiah. And what I wanted to do this morning from the passage that Joanne's just read to us, from 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 1 to 10, is simply look at the question, what makes a person good? What makes a person good in God's sight? If you like, what makes Hezekiah good, King Hezekiah? And the first thing I'd like us to be aware of is it wasn't his dad. It wasn't his father that he got this from. Hezekiah's father was King Ahaz, who, in contrast to Hezekiah, was the worst king that Judah had ever had. Had we looked a couple of chapters before, into chapter 16, verses 2 to 4, we would have read this about Hezekiah's father. Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 16 years. He did not do what was pleasing in the sight of the Lord his God, as his ancestor David had done. Instead, he followed the examples of the kings of Israel, even sacrificing his own son in the fire. That probably means that he made his son pass through flames in some sort of pagan ritual that he would practice. The passage continues, in this way, he followed the detestable practices of the pagan nations the Lord had driven from the land ahead of Israel. He offered sacrifices and burned incense at the pagan shrines and on the hills and under every green tree. Why is that significant that he's not his father? I think it's a really important principle. Here's a man who had a really wicked father who himself became a good and a godly man. Why is that important? Well, it simply tells us this. We are not bound by the failings of the generation that we follow. We are not bound by the way that we were brought up or our backgrounds. You know, some of us might, as children, have had a really bad experience of parents. You know, some of us, our childhood might have been absolutely lousy. What this passage tells us, first and foremost, is that can all end with this generation. We are not bound by the way in which we were brought up. We can be freed from that. What made the difference? Obviously, this man Hezekiah had at least heard an alternative. He'd heard something about God. I remember when Deborah and I were first married, we went to a big church in Enfield in North London. There was a really lovely and a godly old man there who I used to love talking to. He would always seem to have something worth sharing from his knowledge. He was the sort of person who was interested in people, was really compassionate, was highly respected. And he had something in his past that he shared with the minister at the time on the basis that the minister never told anybody else until after he died. He wanted people to know after he died, but not before. And that fact was simply this, that man had been born the unwanted child of an Edinburgh prostitute. Imagine what childhood must have been like there. And yet the outcome was a really godly, gracious man. We are not bound by our background, provided that something comes into our life that changes us, that sets us free. And what we see in this passage, well, Hezekiah's mother's named. Now, what we know about Hezekiah's mother is she was the daughter of a priest. And maybe that was what made all the difference. Certainly from someone, Hezekiah had learnt the things of God. He'd learnt about God. He'd learnt about God's ways. That transformed his life. That's another important principle. You know, it could be for some people a teacher in the children's church. For others, it could be a youth worker. Maybe for some people, it's a chaplain that they encounter. Maybe for others, it's a Christian neighbour or a Christian colleague. But somebody who takes the time to share what they know of God with that person. And that can liberate and that can set them free. That knowledge had given Hezekiah a choice. He could either, knowing now what was right in God's sight, choose to do that, or he could choose to do the alternative, which is do what's right in our own sight. And that's something that the Bible talks quite a lot about. Just let me share with you a couple of chapters from verses from Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 12, verse 15. Fools think their own ways are right, but the wise listen to others. Proverbs 21, 2. People may be right in their own eyes, but the Lord examines the heart. Hezekiah must have known of the things of God, been taught them, thought about them, prayed it through, thought, what does this mean for me in my position, in my generation? And it changed his life. And what we see in our passage is he then acted on that conviction. He removed all the high places. That's where people were making offerings and celebrating and worshipping other gods. He smashed the pillars that were used in such places. He cut down the Assyria poles. That was part of the religions of the land of the past that he got rid of. Now, it's very easy for us to sit and read these things. Oh, yes, he just got rid of those and he cut that down and he smashed those up. And think about it practically. He'd grown up in a land where all these practices and all these things were normal. Where were the festivals? At these places, during these ceremonies. These were times when people would have gathered together. People would have had strong memories of all the good family times they'd had as they'd feasted together in these places. And Hezekiah had the courage to say, no, I've learned better. I am going to be different. I am going to go God's way. Do you know what? I would imagine he was considered a bit of a killjoy. He's spoiling all the fun. He's wrecking life. He's ruining everything. Can you imagine the criticism he must have had? But actually, that was part of the conviction that made Hezekiah good King Hezekiah. You know, saying no is something that often is important, even when it's popular. Those of us who are parents, we must have experienced this to some degree. You know what it's like? The child comes up to you and says, oh, can I do this? I want to do this, or I want to have this thing. And you know it's not good for the child, so you say no. But they say, oh, but I really want it. But you have to say no. And they say, but the argument starts, doesn't it? Everybody else has got one. Everybody else's family did it. Suddenly, you're the worst person in the world, certainly when the kids are in the teenage years. But sometimes we have to say no, and we are failing those people if we don't say no. Hezekiah had the courage and the willingness to do that. And our passage went on and said that he also got rid of the bronze serpent that Moses had made. Now, this bronze serpent that Moses had made, we came across a few weeks ago when we were looking at John's Gospel, John chapter 3. It refers to the incident in Numbers chapter 21, where the people of Israel, right back in the Old Testament, were making their way through the wilderness, and they started to moan about God's provision, and they didn't like the way that they were following God to live. And because of this, God allowed poisonous serpents to come into their camp and was biting them, and they were deadly, and people were passing away. And then they realised, actually, this is because they'd done wrong, and they had to come back to God and say, we're sorry about this. And what God told Moses, the leader of Israel, to do was to make this bronze serpent, to put it up on a pole, and that whenever anybody was bitten by one of those serpents, they were to look on this big bronze serpent that's held up, and they would live. The imagery is actually quite powerful. The serpents were, if you like, the sign of the judgment of God that was coming on these people because they'd rebelled against God. By looking at the serpent that God had provided, they were acknowledging that they'd done wrong and that God had the answer. And when we looked at it in John chapter 3 a few weeks ago, of course, Jesus used that imagery to refer to what he was going to do. He was lifted up on the cross. The cross is a sign of punishment. And he took the penalty for us. And all we have to do is to look to him for forgiveness, and we're set free. We're given life. We're given real spiritual life. And that imagery was there. Now, that serpent that Moses had made, the people of Israel had obviously kept. They must have kept it for about 800 years, carried it round with them. When they got in and settled in the land, they kept it in Jerusalem. Could you imagine the significance that must have been given to it? This is something that was built under the instructions of God. This is something that had really been a blessing to people in the past, and it got such an important place that they're even making offerings to that. It's another really important principle that we see here. Things that maybe in the past were done, maybe with the leading and guiding of God, that were really spiritually useful to the people at the time, that many people have held on to and looked back with nostalgia, actually become a problem. It was a relic. It had no current spiritual meaning or benefit. So Hezekiah said, it's got to go. He got rid of it. Could you imagine that in the Church of England? He's done what? He's smashed it up. He's thrown it away. And he didn't even have a faculty. Faculty is the royal permission we need to change anything in a church building. It's almost unbelievable, but actually the principle is, and it's an important one, there might be things, either in the church or in our lives, that in the past have been greatly used by God, but that was for then. Now they've become a hindrance, and where they're a hindrance, they've got to go. Hezekiah had the courage to do it. What was it in essence that made Hezekiah good King Hezekiah? Verse 5 simply tells us, he trusted in the Lord. Clearly, he did trust in the Lord. It reminds me, that phrase, of the verses that I shared just a couple of weeks ago at the PCC, which I also shared at Griff's Leaving Do, from Proverbs 3, chapters 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. Wonderful verses. Clearly, Hezekiah was trusting and going on trusting. And that's the important thing. Trusting in the Lord is a progressive thing. It's progressive. Let me give you an example. Supposing somebody in this church is asked or feels that they'd like to be involved in helping to run the children's church. and we've got a lot of young people in this church relative to many churches, somebody feels that, they would like to be involved in helping to prepare lessons for them, to teach them, if you like, to give them the opportunity to learn of the things of God so that their lives can be changed. Wonderful thing to do. So somebody says, I'll do that. And yes, I'll trust God. I know it's going to be a bit demanding on my time. It's going to take a couple of hours a week, but I'm going to do that for the benefit of these young people. And maybe we'll do it every few weeks. But then, actually, they realise there's need to do it every week. That's a bit harder, because it takes more time. And if they're going to do that, then it's going to impinge on their other areas of life, because they realise they've got to do a bit of preparing as well. And maybe there are times that they're going to have to sort of do things, special preparation for the particular needs of particular young people. So it's going to take more time. So they think, hang on, my trusting in God, I'll give an hour or two every few weeks, is becoming, I'll give a couple of hours now, and it's going to be sort of every week, and therefore I'm going to have to cut other things in my life out, and there's maybe hobbies and interests. They're going to have to go. So trusting is another level. What if it got to another level? What if what the person was called to do meant, actually, I can't stay in this job I'm in, this career that I've set for myself and I've been following, I've got to give it up? Or what if it meant, actually, if I'm really going to follow God in this way, there's no way I can stay living in this house. I'm going to have to move. Now, trusting in God is a progressive thing. And that we also see in the life of Hezekiah. He trusted God. His father brought him up one way, but he was not going to live like that. He trusted God there. He trusted God in that he was willing to challenge what the people were doing in the land. But what we see at the end of this passage is that he trusted God to a whole new level. The passage refers to what had happened to Israel, the northern kingdom. Israel, the northern kingdom, had been threatened by Assyria. Assyria was, if you like, the rising world dominant power of the day. It was occupying countries all around the region. It was quite ruthless. There was no nation could stand up to it. It was becoming literally the global dominant power of that day. And it was threatening Israel. And after 3 years, Israel fell. It had been occupied. In the past, God had saved Israel, but not this time. This time, Israel had fallen. It had been occupied. Not only that, but the people of Israel were then transported. They were rounded up and transported to another nation. Why had it happened? Well, actually, the passage tells us the people hadn't listened, followed the ways of the Lord God. And therefore, though he protected them in the past, this time he hadn't. And actually, that was the end of the nation of Israel. We never really hear about them again. That was the end of Israel. And what we read in our passage is that Hezekiah rebelled against the king of Assyria. What a step. That is taking trust in the Lord to a whole new level. He'd seen what had happened to Israel. He'd seen the nation be invaded, occupied, the people transported out. He didn't know where. He didn't know what had happened to them. They'd just gone, been taken out. Yet he knew it was not. He basically turned around and said to the king of Assyria, I am not going to serve you. It was taking trust to a whole new level. What made Hezekiah good? He trusted in the Lord with all his heart. Maybe this morning it would be good for each of us to think, well, what about us? Is, in a sense, our background holding us back from following God? These things of our earlier years, that are we being held back by them? Are we willing to say no to the way in which the world lives? You know, those of our church who are still at school. Are we standing up and saying, no, actually, I'm going to follow God no matter what everybody around me is doing? What about those of us who are older? Are we willing to stand up against the norms of what our society says is normal and okay? If we know it's against God's way, are we going to stand up and say so and live our lives differently, even though people might ridicule us? I wonder if any of us have got, if you like, relics, things from the past that we hold too dearly that are hindering our walk with God. And to what level is our trust going to go? What made Hezekiah good King Hezekiah? It was simply this: Hezekiah did what was right in the sight of the Lord.